There were no priority draft picks. There were no concessions. They virtually took the $4 million and ran, and we were left to our own devices.
The way of life that Skase brought into the place that you just couldn't excise out of the joint.
Deep inside each footy club is the story of how it came to be. Team Builders goes behind the scenes with those who made it all happen, to give insight into the creation of some of Australia's biggest football franchises. With Tasmania in the early stages of building a standalone club, after finally being granted a licence to enter the AFL in 2028, the first new club to enter the national competition in 16 years, Team Builders will look back on all the startup teams that joined the then VFL as it expanded beyond the confines of Victoria. From South Melbourne's move to Sydney in 1982, to the Eagles and Bears in 1987, through to Gold Coast and GWS in 2011 and 2012 respectively, we'll talk to inaugural CEOs, presidents, coaches, and star players to get an inside look into how these AFL teams were built from scratch. This is AFL Team Builders.
Welcome to AFL Team Builders. In this episode, we explore possibly the most wild and tumultuous build of them all, the Brisbane Bears. Wild and tumultuous is almost certainly an understatement. From the start, this was a haphazard, last-minute, ill-conceived, slapdash foray into new territory, and looking back, it's remarkable the club survived, let alone eventually thrived. It was late 1986 when the VFL decided to launch a privately owned expansion club in Queensland, a task that surely would have been easier if league bosses attempted to set up a club on Mars instead. Queensland's entry into the big league, when it came, was somewhat fortuitous. The VFL initially preferred a South Australian team to enter the league, alongside one out of Perth. But the South Australian National Football League, the SANFL, balked at being asked to pay what they believed was an exorbitant licence fee of $4 million. That money, also paid by West Coast upon its entry, was to be split among the existing VFL clubs, the majority of which were destitute and demoralised. So, with South Australia reluctant, attention shifted north to Queensland. Towards the end of 1986, the VFL decided Brisbane, alongside West Coast, would be tasked with spreading the game's reach into interstate markets. Uniquely, the Brisbane Bears, as they will become to be known, were to be backed by private ownership, which is almost a podcast series in itself. After much toing and froing between Queensland-based businessmen, VFL power brokers and the Queensland AFL, a consortium headed by former actor Paul Cronin and bankrolled by wealthy entrepreneur Christopher Skase, was awarded the Brisbane licence. Yes, that Christopher Skase, one of Australia's most notorious failed businessmen and later fugitives. It was hardly a stable environment in which to try and launch a professional sporting team, with the late Skase's shadow looming over the entire club, if not the whole northern state, as inaugural board member Peter Williams recalls.
I used to play cricket for a club known as Coomera Hope Island on the Gold Coast. And they were a very strong club, and their home ground was also Carrara, which is where the Bears played their football early on. I turned up one day to play. We used to play cricket on a Saturday and Sunday, and then on a Wednesday, and we used to use the Carrara ground as our home ground. I've turned up there one day, and there's Christopher Skase sitting in one of the grandstands with his helicopter parked on the wicket. so I've gone over to Christopher and I've said, "Listen, mate, can you move your helicopter? We've got a game of cricket that's got to start in half an hour." And he said, "I'm just trying to let you know who's boss."
We'll get back to the infamous Skase later, because much of the club's early years revolved around the charismatic, erratic and egotistical businessman. But another key off-field presence was inaugural General Manager of Football, Shane O'Sullivan. His job was to hastily get all the moving puzzle pieces to fit together in a time frame of approximately 5 months. As he recalls, the excitement of the adventure somehow overshadowed the hurdles everybody at the Bears had to jump over, or sometimes simply crash through.
It was a big list, and to be honest, I was surprised the lack of real sort of organisation before we got there, or before I got the job. It was sort of once I was appointed and I asked a lot of questions, it was sort of up to myself to get it all to happen.
Finding a respected, forward-thinking coach was O'Sullivan's first priority after moving north to head up the ambitious football project. It didn't take him long to reach out to recently retired Hawthorn champion Peter Knights, the pair forging a lifelong relationship after growing up in similar circles in Gippsland. The former Hawthorn great was actually in the process of moving to South Australia when O'Sullivan boldly pitched the job to him, as Knights recalls.
So we just finished the season at the end of September, and I was in a process actually of leaving the state. I'd organised schooling and bought a house in South Australia, and wife and son, we were about to move to Adelaide to start up virtually a new life, a new career. But shortly after that, I got a phone call from Shane O'Sullivan, who had been appointed the general manager of football of what was going to be this new footy team coming out of Queensland. But I'd only heard a little bit about this new national competition starting. There wasn't a lot of media, but there was going to be this new team coming out of WA and a new team coming out of Queensland. But I didn't take a lot of notice of that because I was pretty much focused on my commitments with Hawthorn. And just got this phone call from Shane O'Sullivan, and he just come out and said, "Do you know much about this new team, this new footy club that's being born in Queensland?" I said, "Oh, no, not very much." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Just wondering whether you might be interested in coaching them." And just like there is now, a deadly silence. And, I just had no idea. I was just blown away. And that's how it all started.
It didn't take Knights long to realise the enormity of the task. Although, boasting an adventurous spirit, he was intrigued and excited about the prospect of the new North.
As I said, I was just blown away. So obviously, the first couple of questions I asked Shane, where's this team going to be based? Where's our training base? Oh, we don't have a training base yet. Oh, what's this new team going to be called? Oh, we don't have a name yet. Where's our training facility going to be? We don't have a training facility just yet. What's our Guernsey? What are we going to be known as? What are our colours? Well, none of that's been organised yet. This is 5 months before the season 1987 began. So my final question was, well, okay, who are some of the players that are going to be playing, some of the players that I might be coaching? Oh, we don't have any players yet. So this is 5 months out. So, to make a long story short, it all sounded really exciting. Not many people get an opportunity to go and start a club from scratch. The excitement of being the first coach with this new embryonic footy club in a foreign land such as Queensland. It was all very exciting, but I needed to get a little bit of confidence in talking to a few people that I hold pretty closely. And my three coaches at Hawthorn were legendary John Kennedy, David Park and Alan Jeans. So I had conversations with them, let them know what was going on, just to ask them to think I'm up for it. Because I'd only had 1 year as an assistant coach under Alan Jeans at Hawthorn. But each and every one of them said, so exciting, such a wonderful opportunity. So absolutely, my advice is, give it a go. So that began to get the wheels in motion.
The club was still without a name, colours or a song as Christmas approached in 1986. Then, in December, the Brisbane Bears' name and branding was leaked to the public, with the playing strip to consist of a gold background with a maroon yoke and a triangular BB logo intended to represent a stylised map of Queensland, with the outline of a koala's head appearing inside the larger B. The koala. In an attempt to appeal to children, families and tourists, the club's marketing department intended for the team's mascot to resemble Dreamworld's mascot, Kenny. No one realised, or perhaps no one cared, that despite carrying the Bears' nickname, the club's emblem featured a koala which, of course, while native to Australia, is technically not a bear at all. It was a decision that Skase's fingerprints were all over, as Williams recalls.
Skase, that was his baby. He came up with the logo, he came up with the name, and he came up with the song. Of course, none of those exist now. We changed them pretty quick.
As 1987 loomed, Brisbane may have had its colours, emblem and coach, but the most important element of the sporting team, the players, were still not signed. This was easier said than done, too. The VFL granted its new startup club scant concessions, and opposition clubs were fearful the two new teams, West Coast and Brisbane, would effectively become high-powered state of origin squads, and therefore they fiercely guarded their contracted players. And while the Eagles did enjoy access to some of the best players in their home state, the talent level in Queensland at that time left much to be desired. To be any chance of signing established VFL players, Brisbane was forced to pay through the nose. But few stars made the trip north, as Knights recalls.
Like I said, we didn't have any players, so that was my first commitment. Shane and myself, that was our first commitment, to try and get some players. And unfortunately, the AFL did us no favours. There were no priority draft picks, there were no concessions. They virtually took the $4 million and ran, and we were left to our own devices. So before I could think of anything in reference to training, we had to get players. So Shane and I wildly went about trying to recruit players as best we could. And in doing that, we knew that some of those players were going to be local Queenslanders, but also some options right around the country, that we had to go far and wide to try and get these players. So yeah, it really was head down, bum up initially, and just getting some players until we could get to a stage that we at least had a little bit of a small nucleus of players that we could even consider beginning to train. So we virtually went up to lived in a hotel in Brisbane and did our pre-season training, then out at the Queensland University, and players just gradually trickled in. And by this time it was like 3 and 4 months before the 1987 season began. So you're right, it was head down, bum up, and just get to work in recruiting players, finding somewhere to do our pre-season, and then gradually increasing the number of recruits that we had.
Selling the Brisbane dream to potential recruits was just about impossible. In search of a marquee Queenslander, the Bears approached emerging Hawthorn full forward Jason Dunstall with a monster 10-year deal to spearhead the club, which he turned down. Eventually, the likes of Mark Williams, Brad Hardy, Jeff Rains and Jim Edmund joined the new club as established VFL quality players, while Mark Micken from West Adelaide was signed and then appointed Brisbane's first captain. As O'Sullivan recalls, the club was up against it in terms of building an AFL calibre list.
When you look back, it's amazing that we actually won, 6 games in the first year for the way we were treated. Just to give you an example, any player that was actually contracted that we could entice to the club, for example, Stephen Reynoldsson was contracted to Geelong, and they were happy to do a deal with us, and we did, and come to an arrangement for a transfer fee. And this just shows you what the Bears had to go through. The AFL then put another transfer fee on top of that. So it was a double, just a double hit. But it just staggered me that, it was sort of written in the agreement that if you got a contracted player, you were going to have to, the AFL would put a figure on it. And I think, for example, Ken Gannon and I did a deal for Stephen, as I said, and, I think it was around 50-odd thousand, and then the AFL put another 50 on.
Got it, despite perfect weather. Not a bad kick. Harris has done up. The Bears get their first goal in VFL football.
Another inaugural signing was little-known Fitzroy midfielder Bernie Harris, who had the distinction of kicking the club's first goal in its history. Harris remembers receiving quite the shock when he and some new teammates moved north for the first time.
There was a little bit of training done in Melbourne beforehand. Yeah, I can remember a heap of us flying up from Tullamarine. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it was 2nd, the 3rd or 4th of January, something like that. So it was early January. So as far as the footy goes, yeah, we basically, you might as well say we didn't have a full pre-season. Obviously not ideal, but I mean, that was just the way things worked out. What I can tell you is when we got to Brisbane in early January, they were having record heat. Like they hadn't had heat in Brisbane like that for a long time. So most of our training in January, until it cooled down a bit, we were training at the university in Brisbane, like first thing in the morning. We were doing most of our training first thing in the mornings, just to try try and beat the heat. And and I'm probably talking 37s, 38s, 39s, where Brisbane, as a rule, was, 31, 32, 33, but with a lot of humidity. But it was just, yeah, it was extremely hot. I can remember that.
It wasn't just the training in Brisbane's fierce heat and humidity which made life difficult for the players. In the late 80s, most players were still only semi-professional, so those who moved needed jobs to supplement their income and places to live for themselves and their families. It was a daunting task for O'Sullivan to oversee.
It was interesting because I think I sort of touched on it early. When I got the job, I said, well, where are we all going to live? And, and they said, well, it's up to you to find out. So luckily we had a sort of footy-minded person that was running the Park Royal in Brisbane, and he was fantastic. So I think in January, I forget the exact date, but in 1987, I think there was something like 40, 50 odd people on the plane, all headed up together, and we arrived at the Park Royal and were there for, I think I was there for a good couple of months until we found a place. But it was funny, every time someone got a house, the Friday was like a party at the house to sort of housewarming. So some of those things were really good, where it sort of got everyone together, and certainly made things a bit easier for everyone to get to know each other pretty quickly. And over the next 3 or so years, there was a lot of children born, so the creche was pretty busy at Carrara as well.
The Bears were flying blind through much of their first off-season. For first-time coach Knights, any thoughts of establishing a game plan for Brisbane's upcoming debut season had to take a back seat, purely because of some logistical issues that he and other club leaders faced. While he tried to keep a brave face and approach the task with a positive mindset, he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back as the first season approached.
The time frame is the big thing when you think about, say, Gold Coast Suns. 3 years was their timeline. I mean, most of those other clubs that have begun in similar fashion in one way, the concessions that they had, the resources that they were given, the timeline that they had. It's just laughable when you think back on it now that we had like 5 months when I was first approached, say 4 months if you'd like to really get the team together. We couldn't be thinking about anything like game plans or creating a culture or doing anything like that. We just had to get players. We had to get a facility then to train where we were going to be training during the coming winter months. So there was so much to be done. Support staff, we had to get support staff organised both in Brisbane and down in Victoria as well, because a lot of the players that we were recruiting were still even living in other states before we could get them moved up to Queensland. The job that the likes of Shane had off-field was just enormous. Fortunately, I didn't take too much notice of that in reference having to do much assistance myself, because I just really had to get into the business of training the players and preparing them. All as I could say was that it was exciting, it was challenging. We're all in the same boat. We're all new. It was a foreign legion. They were coming from various states. There were probably about 15 or so local Queenslanders that had been playing in the QAFL. They knew each other a little bit, but we're all just sort of coming together, introductions, knowing that the season is nigh virtually. So, I know I keep using the word challenging and exciting, but they were the two adjectives that I've always used, and it just was something that no one had ever done before. No one had ever been given this sort of timeline with this sort of challenge in front, and that's why I commend the players that did come up. To come up to a state like Queensland that at that stage was like a foreign land. Like AFL was behind rugby league, rugby union, basketball, baseball. We weren't even known about it. The game wasn't even played in any of the schools up there. We had no support from the media, corporate, no support. There was so much uncertainty. Well, we did most of our pre-season, as I said, out at Queensland Uni, so that was just like a little portable set of equipment that we had. once we got closer, once we got into 1987, and we might have been, say, a couple of months away from the season proper beginning, we then began really our nomadic existence, that we were training in different facilities. Like, we didn't have our own gymnasium, we didn't have our own social facility, and that was going to be a big part of building a bit of camaraderie and mateship somewhere socially to get together. There was none of that. So we were just training at different places, just trying, whether it be at Kedron or at Maine or at Windsor-Zillmere, or just different places all over Brisbane, because at that stage, most of the players and the staff, we were based in Brisbane because we still thought that's where we're going to be playing.
Carrara, the name of the Gold Coast suburb, still sends shivers up the spine of those involved with the Bears in those first couple of years. Carrara Stadium, now the home ground of Brisbane's cross-state rivals the Gold Coast Suns, was suddenly thrust upon the Bears as a new home base just months before their debut season. Some 70 kilometres from the state's capital, the decision to shift a Brisbane-based entity's home games an hour and a half's drive on a decent traffic day made no sense to anybody except for that man Skase. Just before 1986 clicked over into 1987, the flamboyant businessman announced the club would use Carrara Oval as their home ground, with Skase spending $1 million to redevelop the Oval over a 10-week period at the beginning of 1987. For a club already struggling to make any inroads into Brisbane's sporting landscape, the club had a huge disconnect between it and the people that it wanted to reach, namely fans, media organisations and commercial and corporate partners based in Brisbane. For Knight, it was just another hurdle to jump.
Of course, as it got closer to the season, we found out Christopher wanted the home games to be played down at Carrara. So it was so difficult, mostly, that we just didn't have any facilities. So we just had to make do. That's why what was achieved, especially in those first couple of years being nomads, what the players achieved was sometimes it is really forgotten about just what they did achieve. Well, virtually we did all of our training still in Brisbane. And once the season did begin, I just forget what round it was, we played our first home game down at Carrara. But virtually everything else was done in Brisbane. Our offices were at Gabba Towers, right alongside the Gabba. So I think about the 8th floor, and we could look down on the Gabba and thinking, how good would this to be playing here? Even though the dog track was still around there at that stage. So that was our admin base. Our training facilities were anywhere in and around Brisbane. So through 87, we only went down to Carrara to play our home games. Because again, as I said, I think with the exception of one player, might have been two, everyone had relocated to Brisbane. That's where we're at.
O'Sullivan too looks back at the decision to play home games in Carrara as a massive blunder, and not one that Skase made with the club or the code's best interests at heart. Rather, it was likely a way to simply boost the bottom line of Skase's iconic Sheraton Grand Mirage Resort Hotel, just north of Surfers Paradise.
Well, certainly a mistake, but no doubt you've got to play where the population is, and but we all got called to Christopher's office and boardroom. Families and everyone got told we're going to be playing permanently down at Carrara, which certainly threw the cat amongst the pigeons. That's for sure. It sort of got everyone pretty upset because so many people either brought or were renting in Brisbane, and to think you have to drive down to Carrara and that for training as well. It certainly made things a bit awkward. But when you don't have the major newspaper really covering you, the Gold Coast Bulletin was good, but it certainly didn't reach the population that we needed. So it was sort of disappointing. So we certainly were hoping that we could have got to play at the Gabba, but it wasn't to be. As we know, the Gold Coast is such a transient sort of situation anyway. So it certainly, as I said, I played a state game myself, and there were 16,500 people. Well, we weren't getting that sort of crowd at different stages down at Carrara, where I think we would have got those sort of crowds, if we had played in Brisbane itself at the Gabba. Perhaps he's, with his Mirage, resorts and sort of thought that, that was sort of the best option at the time. They put the light towers in and things like that, so for night footy. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I sort of think it was more to do with, attracting people to the coast rather than sort of, thinking a bit more long term about, population or people we could get to the games.
Former board member Williams recalls another element of the Carrara move that proved difficult. The sun, the glitz and the glamour of the Gold Coast proving a distraction for the players.
Right up there at the top at the time. And that was part of the problem. But the girls who'd come up from Melbourne, they knew these players. In Melbourne, they couldn't get near them. But on the Gold Coast, they could drive into our facilities and say, look, boys, we've got a party on tonight. Do you want to come? And the social life for a bear in Brisbane on the Gold Coast was just a smorgasbord. I mean, it was just a smorgasbord. Many, many times we'd see half a dozen cars parked outside the change rooms and the guys would all head off with girls in the cars. Because of who some of the players were, they'd got to the end of their careers and whether they were married or not, they enjoyed the life, and football became not as important as their social life.
It wasn't just the external distractions that were an issue for the club. Internally, things weren't much different. Far from providing the Bears players with a stable environment to perform their best on the field, Skase fragrantly showcased his extravagance at club functions, and some of the players were unable to put all their focus into footy.
What was to happen at the club, and some of the things that they did, the excesses were just ridiculous. He would fly orchids from Kangaroo Valley, south of Sydney, just to put on the tables, to dress the tables up for what they called the chairman's group, which was a senior coterie group. And I actually was in that group, so I saw all this. He would fly sort of prawns in from Thursday Island just to have fresh prawns there, ridiculous excesses. Just way over the top. Some of the things that I can tell you, I don't really want ever to be sort of recorded, but Skase would have private parties, and he would invite players to those parties, and some of the things that happened there, you certainly wouldn't want to know about today, if you understand what I'm saying. And we had a young bloke, David Bain. David Bain, I think, only ended up playing about 50 games. But he won a best and fairest at 21 years of age. The parties and life that he got into destroyed that kid. And from my point of view, I'm telling you this even though I'm not a little uncomfortable telling you, because it was sort of the excesses and the way of life that Skase brought into the place that you just couldn't excise out of the joint. And, the sort of environment he created, you just couldn't get it out.
All these distractions and difficulties added up to a less than perfect off-season, and it probably helped to have the ebbs and flows of an actual footy campaign to focus on. Finally, on March 27, barely 5 months after its inception, the Brisbane Bears Football Club ran out onto the field for the first game against North Melbourne at the MCG. As Knights recalls, it was a daunting first-up assignment, but one the players were up for, with the Bears shocking the football world by beating the Kangaroos, who had played off in a semi-final just 2 years earlier, by 33 points.
Picked up by Bernie Harris, out to Jeffrey Rains, and it's fitting that Rains has the last kick. And the final score, a resounding, a memorable, a magnificent win to the Brisbane Bears, 19 goals, 23, 137, defeating North Melbourne 15-14, 104.
Game. So we'd been written off before the season had even started. So players deep down had felt as if they had something to prove, as we as coaches did as well. Right through that build up to the season 87, they'll never win a game. And then round one, of course, 1987, who were we going to be playing? But North Melbourne on the Friday night, the night game specialists, they were at that particular stage, that was going to kick off round one of 1987 with this new national competition. Who was coaching North Melbourne at that time? John Kennedy. My first coach at Hawthorn, the legendary John Kennedy. So that was a little intimidating for me as well. But that first game, the euphoria around going to Melbourne, putting the Guernsey on, proving a point, the adrenaline that was pumping, and as history tells us, we won that very first game. And, we all have seen the photographs of song sheets being handed out so we could get around and sing the song off the song sheet. It was an amazing adrenaline rush. And then, of course, round two, we're also away. We had to go down to Cardinia Park down at Geelong, which is never a happy hunting ground. And we defeated Geelong as well down at Cardinia Park. So we won our first two games. So, how easy is this coaching caper? But that's what happens on emotion, and you've got a point to prove, and that can wear off after a little while. But just to win those first two games, that set the footy world alight.
Those two first away wins against the Kangaroos and the Cats not only shocked the VFL world, but injected a huge wave of belief and positive energy into the Bears. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, the wins soon dried up. Brisbane can only manage 4 more victories for the season, and crowd support nosedived from 17,795 for the first game to a paltry 4,800 for the round 20 clash against fellow expansion side West Coast. Remarkably, those early dark days were a period that most involved still look back on with fondness, even Knights, who was sacked midway through his 3rd season. Importantly, Knight says those early Bad News Bears days helped set a foundation for football in Queensland, which flourished further after the club merged with Fitzroy to become the modern-day Brisbane Lions in 1997.
When I talk to people now who, it's over 35 years ago, and a lot of young players have got no idea about how Brisbane was formed. I can remember back in the 2000s when Lee Matthews was up, good mate of mine, coaching Brisbane. He asked me to go up and present the Guernseys to the players and talk a little bit about the early days of the Bears and how hard they had it in comparison to what then the facilities that the Bears, the Lions had, so that they could appreciate where it all started. They didn't even have any idea back in those early 2000s that where the original Brisbane Football Club began and how hard they did it, and were given no help, no assistance at all. So very much built that mindset about us versus them, if you would like, and that's where it all began. For me, the first 3 years that I was there was very much that sort of challenging environment. But again, not many get a chance to experience that sort of excitement and those sort of challenges. And wouldn't, before you ask the question, there'd be nothing that I would change again. And the players and the support staff, coaches, did an amazing job in creating that foundation from virtually nothing, with no help from the AFL whatsoever. We as a playing group, the expectations of us were, well, we've got nothing to lose, let's just go for it. So everyone that was involved, that whole group, have got something to be proud of. No one or group, small group, take any pats on the back. It was the whole group that they really did achieve something under extenuating circumstances. I don't think any of the new football clubs that have been set up went anywhere near what the Brisbane Bears went through in their formation.
Thanks for listening to AFL Team Builders, a ZeroHanger.com production. In our next episode, we examine fellow 1987 expansion club West Coast. While the Eagles quickly established themselves as a footy powerhouse, it wasn't without significant challenges along the way.
It sticks in my mind that day, Graham Moss, ex-Essendon champion, Brownlow medalist, walking out of Windy Hill getting spat on by the Essendon supporters. And that showed, the passion and a lot of antagonism to the Eagles being created.